wagons, on horses, on foot, then to be ferried across the Mississippi River. The army was supposed to organize their trek, but it turned over its job to private contractors who charged the government as much as possible, gave the Indians as little as possible. Everything was disorganized. Food disappeared. Hunger came. Van Every again. The long, somber columns of groaning ox wagons, driven herds, and straggling crowds on foot inched on westward through swamps and forests, across rivers and over hills, in their crawling struggle from the lush lowlands of the Gulf to the arid plains of the West. In a kind of death spasm, one of the last vestiges of the original Indian world was being dismembered, and its collapsing remnants jammed bodily into an alien new world. The first winter migration was one of the coldest on record, and people began to die of pneumonia. In the summer, a major cholera epidemic hit Mississippi, and Choctaws died by the hundreds. The 7,000 Choctaws left behind now refused to go, choosing subjugation over death. Many of their descendants still live in Mississippi. As for the Cherokees, they faced a set of laws passed by Georgia. Their lands were taken, their government abolished, all meetings prohibited. Cherokees advising others not to migrate were to be imprisoned. Cherokees could not testify in court against any white. Cherokees could not dig for the gold recently discovered on their land. A delegation of them, protesting to the federal government, received this reply from Jackson's new Secretary of War, Eaton. "If you will go to the setting sun, there you will be happy. There you can remain in peace and quietness. So long as the waters run and the oaks grow, that country shall be guaranteed to you, and no white man shall be permitted to settle near you." The Cherokee Nation addressed a memorial to the nation, a public plea for justice. They reviewed their history. After the peace of 1783, the Cherokees were an independent people, absolutely so, as much as any people on earth. They had been allies to Great Britain. The United States never subjugated the Cherokees. On the contrary, our fathers remained in possession of their country and with arms in their hands. In 1791, the Treaty of Holston was made. The Cherokees acknowledged themselves to be under the protection of the United States and of no other sovereign. A cession of land was also made to the United States. On the other hand, the United States stipulated that white men should not hunt on these lands, not even enter the country, without a passport, and gave a solemn guarantee of all Cherokee lands not ceded. They discussed removal. "We are aware that some persons suppose it will be for our advantage to remove beyond the Mississippi. We think otherwise. Our people universally think otherwise. We wish to remain on the land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation. The treaties with us and laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties guarantee our residence and our privileges and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties be fulfilled and these laws executed." Now they went beyond history, beyond law. "We entreat those to whom the foregoing paragraphs are addressed to remember the great law of love. Do to others as ye would that others should do to you. We pray them to remember that, for the sake of principle, their forefathers were compelled to leave, therefore driven from the old world, and that the winds of persecution wafted them over the great waters and landed them on the shores of the New World, when the Indian was the sole lord and the proprietor of these extensive domains. Let them remember in what way they were received by the savage of America, when power was in his hand, and his ferocity could not be restrained by any human arm. We urge them to bear in mind that those who would not ask of them a cup of cold water and a spot of earth are the descendants of these, whose origin as inhabitants of North America, history and tradition are alike insufficient to reveal. Let them bring to remembrance all these facts, and they cannot, and we are sure they will not fail to remember and sympathize with us in these our trials and sufferings." Jackson's response to this, in his second annual message to Congress in December 1830, was to point to the fact that the Choctaws and Chickasaws had already agreed to removal, and that a speedy removal of the rest would offer many advantages to everyone. For whites, it will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. For Indians, it will perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. He reiterated a familiar theme. Toward the aborigines of the country, no one can indulge a more friendly feeling than myself. However, the waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange. Georgia passed a law making it a crime for a white person to stay in Indian territory without taking an oath to the state of Georgia. When the white missionaries in the Cherokee territory declared their sympathies openly for the Cherokees to stay, Georgia militia entered the territory in the spring of 1831 and arrested 3 of the missionaries, including Samuel Worcester. They were released when they claimed protection as federal employees. Worcester was a federal postmaster. Immediately, the Jackson administration took away Worcester's job, and the militia moved in again that summer, arresting 10 missionaries, as well as the white printer of the Cherokee Phoenix. They were beaten, chained, and forced to march 35 miles a day to the county jail. A jury tried them, found them guilty. 9 were released when they agreed to swear allegiance to Georgia's laws, but Samuel Worcester and Eliza Butler, who refused to grant legitimacy to the laws repressing the Cherokees, were sentenced to 4 years at hard labor. This was appealed to the Supreme Court, and in Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall, for the majority, declared that the Georgia law on which Worcester was jailed violated the treaty with the Cherokees, which by the Constitution was binding on the states. He ordered Worcester freed. Georgia ignored him, and President Jackson refused to enforce the court order. Georgia now put Cherokee land on sale and moved militia in to crush any sign of Cherokee resistance. The Cherokees followed a policy of nonviolence. Though their property was being taken, their homes were being burned, their schools were closed, their women mistreated, and liquor was being sold in their churches to render them even more helpless. The same year, Jackson was declaring states' rights for Georgia on the Cherokee question in 1832. He was attacking South Carolina's right to nullify a federal tariff. His easy re-election in 1832, 687,000 to 530,000 for his opponent Henry Clay, suggested that his anti-Indian policies were in keeping with popular sentiment, at least among those white males who could vote, perhaps 2 million of the total population of 13 million. Jackson now moved to speed up Indian removal. Most of the Choctaws and some of the Cherokees were gone, but there were still 22,000 Creeks in Alabama, 18,000 Cherokees in Georgia, and 5,000 Seminoles in Florida. The Creeks had been fighting for their land ever since the years of Columbus against Spaniards, English, French, and Americans. But by 1832, they had been reduced to a small area in Alabama, while the population of Alabama, growing fast, was now 300,000. On the basis of extravagant promises from the federal government, Creek delegates in Washington signed the Treaty of Washington, agreeing to removal beyond the Mississippi. They gave up 5 million acres with the provision that 2 million of these would go to individual Creeks, who could either sell or remain in Alabama with federal protection. Van Every writes of this treaty: the interminable history of diplomatic relations between Indians and white men had, before 1832, recorded no single instance of a treaty which had not been presently broken by the white parties to it, however solemnly established with such terms as permanent, forever, for all time, so long as the sun shall rise. But no agreement between white men and Indians had ever been so soon abrogated as the 1832 Treaty of Washington. Within days, the promises made in it on behalf of the United States had been broken. A white invasion of Creek lands began. Looters, land seekers, defrauders, whiskey sellers, thugs, driving thousands of Creeks from their homes into the swamps and forests. The federal government did nothing. Instead, it negotiated a new treaty providing for prompt emigration west, managed by the Creeks themselves, financed by the national government. An army colonel, dubious that this would work, wrote, "They fear starvation on the route, and can it be otherwise when many of them are nearly starving now, without the embarrassment of a long journey on their hands? You cannot have an idea of the deterioration which these Indians have undergone during the last 2 or 3 years, from a general state of comparative plenty to that of unqualified wretchedness and want. The free egress into the nation by the whites, encroachments upon their lands, even upon their cultivated fields, abuses of their person, hosts of traders who, like locusts, have devoured their substance and inundated their homes with whiskey, have destroyed what little disposition to cultivation the Indians may once have had. They are browbeat and cowed and imposed upon and depressed with the feeling that they have no adequate protection in the United States and no capacity for self-protection in themselves." Northern political sympathizers with the Indian seemed to be fading away, preoccupied with other issues. Daniel Webster was making a rousing speech in the Senate for the authority of law, the power of the general government. But he was not referring to Alabama, Georgia, and the Indians. He was talking about South Carolina's nullification of the tariff. Despite the hardships, the Creeks refused to budge. But by 1836, both state and federal officials decided they must go. Using as a pretext some attacks by desperate Creeks on white settlers, it was declared that the Creek Nation, by making war, had forfeited its treaty rights. The army would now force it to migrate west. Fewer than 100 Creeks had been involved in the war, but 1,000 had fled into the woods, afraid of white reprisals. An army of 11,000 was sent after them. The Creeks did not resist. No shots were fired. They surrendered. Those Creeks presumed by the army to be rebels or sympathizers were assembled, the men manacled and chained together to march westward under military guard, their women and children trailing after them. Creek communities were invaded by military detachments, the inhabitants driven to assembly points and marched westward in batches of 2,000 and 3,000. No talk of compensating them for land or property left behind. Private contracts were made for the march, the same kind that had failed for the Choctaws. Again, delays and lack of food, shelter, clothing, blankets, medical attention. Again, old rotting steamboats and ferries, crowded beyond capacity, taking them across the Mississippi. By midwinter, the interminable stumbling procession of more than 15,000 Creeks stretched from border to border across Arkansas. Starvation and sickness began to cause large number of deaths. The passage of the exiles could be distinguished from afar by the howling of trailing wolf packs and the circling flocks of buzzards, Van Every writes. 800 Creek men had volunteered to help the United States Army fight the Seminoles in Florida, in return for a promise that their families could remain in Alabama, protected by the federal government until the men returned. The promise was not kept. The Creek families were attacked by land-hungry white marauders, robbed, driven from their homes, women raped. Then the army, claiming it was for their safety, removed them from Creek country to a concentration camp on Mobile Bay. Hundreds died there from lack of food and from sickness. When the warriors returned from the Seminole War, they and their families were hustled west. Moving through New Orleans, they encountered a yellow fever plague. They crossed the Mississippi. 611 Indians crowded onto the aged steamer Monmouth. It went down in the Mississippi River, and 311 people died. 4 of them the children of the Indian commander of the Creek Volunteers in Florida. A New Orleans newspaper wrote, "The fearful responsibility for this vast sacrifice of human life rests on the contractors. The avaricious disposition to increase the profits on the speculation first induced the chartering of rotten, old, and unseaworthy boats, because they were of a class to be procured cheaply, and then to make those increased profits still larger, The Indians were packed upon those crazy vessels in such crowds that not the slightest regard seems to have been paid to their safety, comfort, or even decency. The Choctaws and Chickasaws had quickly agreed to migrate. The Creeks were stubborn and had to be forced. The Cherokees were practicing a nonviolent resistance. One tribe, the Seminoles, decided to fight. With Florida now belonging to the United States, Seminole territory was open to American land grabbers. They moved down into North Florida from St. Augustine to Pensacola and down the fertile coastal strip. In 1823, the Treaty of Camp Moultrie was signed by a few Seminoles who got large personal landholdings in North Florida and agreed that all the Seminoles would leave northern Florida and every coastal area and move into the interior. This meant withdrawing into the swamps of central Florida, where they could not grow food, where even wild game could not survive. The pressure to move west out of Florida mounted, and in 1834, Seminole leaders were assembled, and the U.S. Indian agent told them they must move west. Here were some of the replies of the Seminoles at that meeting. "We were all made by the same great Father, and are all alike his children. We all came from the same mother, and were suckled at the same breast. Therefore, we are brothers, and as brothers should treat together in an amicable way. Your talk is a good one, but my people cannot say they will go. We are not willing to do so. If their tongues say yes, their hearts cry no and call them liars. If suddenly we tear our hearts from the homes around which they are twined, our heartstrings will snap." The Indian agent managed to get 15 chiefs and sub-chiefs to sign a removal treaty. The U.S. Senate promptly ratified it, and the War Department began making preparations for the migration. Violence between whites and Seminoles now erupted. A young Seminole chief, Osceola, who had been imprisoned and chained by the Indian agent Thompson, and whose wife had been delivered into slavery, became a leader of the growing resistance. When Thompson ordered the Seminoles in December 1835 to assemble for the journey, no one came. Instead, the Seminoles began a series of guerrilla attacks on white coastal settlements all along the Florida perimeter, striking in surprise and in succession from the interior. They murdered white families, captured slaves, destroyed property. Osceola himself, in a lightning stroke, shot down Thompson and an Army lieutenant. That same day, December 28, 1835, a column of 110 soldiers was attacked by Seminoles, and all but 3 soldiers were killed. One of the survivors later told the story. "It was 8 o'clock. Suddenly I heard a rifle shot, followed by a musket shot. I had not time to think of the meaning of these shots before a volley, as if from 1,000 rifles, was poured in upon us from the front and all along our left flank. I could only see their heads and arms peering out from the long grass, far and near, and from behind pine trees." It was the classic Indian tactic against a foe with superior firearms. General George Washington had once given parting advice to one of his officers. General St. Clair, in 3 words, "Beware of surprise." Again and again, General, beware of surprise. Congress now appropriated money for a war against the Seminoles. In the Senate, Henry Clay of Kentucky opposed the war. He was an enemy of Jackson, a critic of Indian removal, but his Whig colleague, Daniel Webster, displayed that unity across party lines which became standard in American wars. The view taken by the gentleman from Kentucky was undoubtedly the true one. But the war rages, the enemy is in force, and the accounts of their ravages are disastrous. The executive government has asked for the means of suppressing these hostilities, and it was entirely proper that the bill should pass. General Winfield Scott took charge, but his columns of troops, marching impressively into Seminole territory, found no one. They became tired of the mud, the swamps, the heat, the sickness, the hunger, the classic fatigue of a civilized army fighting people on their own land. No one wanted to face Seminoles in the Florida swamps. In 1836, 103 commissioned officers resigned from the regular army, leaving only 46. In the spring of 1837, Major General Jessup moved into the war with an army of 10,000, but the Seminoles just faded into the swamps, coming out from time to strike at isolated forces. The war went on for years. The army enlisted other Indians to fight the Seminoles, but that didn't work either. Van Every says, "The adaptation of the Seminole to his environment was to be matched only by the crane or the alligator." It was an 8-year war. It cost $20 million and 1,500 American lives. Finally, in the 1840s, the Seminoles began to get tired. They were a tiny group against a huge nation with great resources. They asked for truces. But when they went forward under truce flags, they were arrested again and again. In 1837, Osceola, under a flag of truce, had been seized and put in irons, then died of illness in prison. The war petered out. Meanwhile, the Cherokees had not fought back with arms, but had resisted in their own way. And so the government began to play Cherokee against Cherokee, the old game. The pressures built up on the Cherokee community. Their newspaper suppressed, their government dissolved, the missionaries in jail, their land parceled among whites by the land lottery. In 1834, 700 Cherokees, weary of the struggle, agreed to go west. 81 died en route, including 45 children, mostly from measles and cholera. Those who lived arrived at their destination across the Mississippi in the midst of a cholera epidemic, and half of them died within a year. The Cherokees were summoned to sign the removal treaty in New Ecotah, Georgia in 1836, but fewer than 500 of the 17,000 Cherokees appeared. The treaty was signed anyway. The Senate, including Northerners who had once spoken for the Indian, ratified it, yielding, as Senator Edward Everett of Massachusetts said, to the force of circumstances, the hard necessity. Now the Georgia whites stepped up their attacks to speed the removal. The government did not move immediately against the Cherokees. In April 1838, Ralph Waldo Emerson addressed an open letter to President Van Buren, referring with indignation to the removal treaty with the Cherokees, signed behind the backs of an overwhelming majority of them, and asked what had happened to the sense of justice in America. The soul of man, the justice, the mercy that is the heart's heart in all men, from Maine to Georgia, does abhor this business. A crime is projected that confounds our understandings by its magnitude, a crime that really deprives us as well as the Cherokees of a country. For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country anymore? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy, and the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world. 13 days before Emerson sent this letter, Martin Van Buren had ordered Major General Winfield Scott into Cherokee territory to use whatever military force was required to move the Cherokees west. 5 regiments of regulars and 4,000 militia and volunteers began pouring into Cherokee country. General Scott addressed the Indians. Cherokees, the President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army to cause you, in obedience to the Treaty of 1834, to join that part of your people who are already established in prosperity on the other side of the Mississippi. The full moon of May is already on the wane, and before another shall have passed, every Cherokee man, woman, and child must be in motion to join their brethren in the far west. My troops already occupy many positions in the country that you are about to abandon, and thousands are approaching from every quarter to tender resistance and escape alike hopeless. Chiefs, headmen, and warriors, will you then, by resistance, compel us resort to arms? God forbid. Or will you, by flight, seek to hide yourselves in mountains and forests, and thus oblige us to hunt you down? Some Cherokees had apparently given up on nonviolence. 3 chiefs who signed the removal treaty were found dead. But the 17,000 Cherokees were soon rounded up and crowded into stockades. On October 1st, 1838, the first detachment set out in what was to be known as the Trail of Tears. As they moved westward, they began to die of sickness, of drought, of the heat, of exposure. There were 645 wagons and people marching alongside. Survivors, years later, told of halting at the edge of the Mississippi, in the middle of winter, the river running full of ice. Hundreds of sick and dying penned up in wagons or stretched upon the ground. Grant Foreman, the leading authority on Indian removal, estimates that during confinement in the stockade or on the march westward, 4,000 Cherokees died. In December 1838, President Van Buren spoke to Congress. It affords sincere pleasure to apprise the Congress of the entire removal of the Cherokee Nation of Indians to their new homes west of the Mississippi. The measures authorized by Congress at its last session have had the happiest effects. Chapter 8. We take nothing by conquest, thank God. Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, a professional soldier, graduate of the military academy, commander of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, a reader of Shakespeare, Chaucer, Hegel, Spinoza, wrote in his diary, Fort Jessup, Louisiana, June 30, 1845. Orders came last evening by express from Washington City, directing General Taylor to move without any delay to some point on the coast near the Sabine or elsewhere, and as soon as he shall hear of the acceptance by the Texas Convention of the annexation resolutions of our Congress, he is immediately to proceed with his whole command to the extreme western border of Texas and take up a position on the banks of or near the Rio Grande, and he is to expel any armed force of Mexicans who may cross that river. Bliss read the orders to me last evening hastily at tattoo. I have scarcely slept a wink, thinking of the needful preparations. I am now noting at reveille by candlelight, and waiting the signal for muster. Violence leads to violence, and if this movement of ours does not lead to others and to bloodshed, I am much mistaken. Hitchcock was not mistaken. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had doubled the territory of the United States, extending it to the Rocky Mountains. To the southwest was Mexico, which had won its independence in a revolutionary war against Spain in 1821, a large country which included Texas and what are now New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado. After agitation and aid from the United States, Texas broke off from Mexico in 1836 and declared itself the Lone Star Republic. In 1845, the U.S. Congress brought it into the Union as a state. In the White House now was James Polk, a Democrat, an expansionist, who on the night of his inauguration confided to his Secretary of the Navy that one of his main objectives was the acquisition of California. His order to General Taylor to move troops to the Rio Grande was a challenge to the Mexicans. It was not at all clear that the Rio Grande was the southern boundary of Texas, although Texas had forced the defeated Mexican general Santa Anna to say so when he was a prisoner. The traditional border between Texas and Mexico had been the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north, and both Mexico and the United States had recognized that as the border. However, Polk, encouraging the Texans to accept the annexation, had assured them that he would uphold their claims to the Rio Grande. Ordering troops to the Rio Grande, into territory inhabited by Mexicans, was clearly a provocation. Taylor had once denounced the idea of the annexation of Texas, but now that he had his marching orders, his attitude seemed to change. His visit to the tent of his aide Hitchcock to discuss the move is described in Hitchcock's diary. He seems to have lost all respect for Mexican rights and is willing to be an instrument of Mr. Polk for pushing our boundary as far west as possible. When I told him that, if he suggested a movement, which he told me he intended, Mr. Polk would seize upon it and throw the responsibility on him, he at once said he would take it, and added that if the president instructed him to use his discretion, he would ask no orders, but would go upon the Rio Grande as soon as he could get in transportation. I think the general wants an additional brevet, and would strain a point to get it. Taylor moved his troops to Corpus Christi, Texas, just across the Nueces River, and waited further instructions. They came in February 1846 to go down the Gulf Coast to the Rio Grande. Taylor's army marched in parallel columns across the open prairie, scouts far ahead and on the flanks, a train of supplies following. Then, along a narrow road through a belt of thick chaparral, they arrived, March 28th, 1846, in cultivated fields and thatch-roof huts, hurriedly abandoned by the Mexican occupants, who had fled across the river to the city of Matamoros. Taylor set up camp, began construction of a fort, and implanted his cannons facing the white houses of Matamoros, whose inhabitants stared curiously at the sight of an army on the banks of a quiet river. The Washington Union, a newspaper expressing the position of President Polk and the Democratic Party, had spoken early in 1845 on the meaning of Texas annexation. Let the great measure of annexation be accomplished, and with it the questions of boundary and claims. For who can arrest the torrent that will pour onward to the west? The road to California will be open to us. Who will stay the march of our western people? They could have meant a peaceful march westward, except for other words in the same newspaper. A corps of properly organized volunteers would invade, overrun, and occupy Mexico. They would enable us not only to take California, but to keep it. It was shortly after that, in the summer of 1845, that John O'Sullivan, editor of the Democratic Review, used that phrase that became famous, saying it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Yes, manifest destiny. All that was needed in the spring of 1846 was a military incident to begin the war that Polk wanted. It came in April, when General Taylor's quartermaster, Colonel Cross, while riding up the Rio Grande, disappeared. His body was found 11 days later, his skull smashed by a heavy blow. It was assumed he had been killed by Mexican guerrillas crossing the river. In a solemn military ceremony visible to the Mexicans of Matamoros, crowding onto the roofs of their houses across the Rio Grande, Cross was buried with a religious service and 3 volleys of rifle fire. The next day, April 25, a patrol of Taylor's soldiers was surrounded and attacked by Mexicans and wiped out. 16 dead, others wounded, the rest captured. Taylor sent a message to the governors of Texas and Louisiana, asking them to recruit 5,000 volunteers. He had been authorized to do this by the White House before he left for Texas. He sent a dispatch to Polk. Hostilities may now be considered as commenced. The Mexicans had fired the first shot, but they had done what the American government wanted, according to Colonel Hitchcock, who wrote in his diary even before those first incidents. I have said from the first that the United States are the aggressors. We have not one particle of right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war, so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this country as it chooses. For whatever becomes of this army, there is no doubt of a war between the United States and Mexico. My heart is not in this business, but as a military man, I am bound to execute orders. And before those first clashes, Taylor had sent dispatches to Polk, which led the president to note that the probabilities are that hostilities might take place soon. On May 9, before news of any battles, Polk was suggesting to his cabinet a declaration of war based on certain money claims against Mexico and on Mexico's recent rejection of an American negotiator named John Slidell. Polk recorded in his diary what he said to the cabinet meeting. I stated that up to this time, as we knew, we had heard of no open act of aggression by the Mexican army, but that the danger was imminent, that such acts would be committed. I said that in my opinion we had ample cause of war, and that it was impossible that I could remain silent much longer, that the country was excited and impatient on the subject. The country was not excited and impatient, but the president was. When the dispatches arrived from General Taylor telling of casualties from the Mexican attack, Polk summoned the cabinet to hear the news, and they unanimously agreed he should ask for a declaration of war. Polk's message to Congress was indignant. The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, the Rio Grande. But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. As war exists, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country. Polk spoke of the dispatch of American troops to the Rio Grande as a necessary measure of defense. As John Schroeder says in Polk's War, indeed the reverse was true. President Polk had incited war by sending American soldiers into what was disputed territory, historically controlled and inhabited by Mexicans. Congress then rushed to approve the war message. Schroeder comments, "The disciplined Democratic majority in the House responded with alacrity and high-handed efficiency to Polk's May 11th war recommendations. The bundles of official documents accompanying the war message, supposed to be evidence for Polk's statement, were not examined, but were tabled immediately by the House. Debate on the bill providing volunteers and money for the war was limited to 2 hours, and most of this was used up reading selected portions of the tabled documents, so that barely a half hour was left for discussion of the issues." The Whig Party was presumably against the war in Mexico, but it was not against expansion. The Whigs wanted California, but preferred to do it without a war. As Schroeder puts it, theirs was a commercially oriented expansionism designed to secure frontage on the Pacific without recourse to war. Also, they were not so powerfully against the military action that they would stop it by denying men and money for the operation. They did not want to risk the accusation that they were putting American soldiers in peril by depriving them of the materials necessary to fight. The result was that Whigs joined Democrats in voting overwhelmingly for the war resolution, 174 to 14. The opposition was a small group of strongly anti-slavery Whigs, or a little knot of ultraists, as one Massachusetts congressman who voted for the war measure put it. In the Senate, there was debate, but it was limited to 1 day. The tactics of stampede were there repeated, according to historian Frederick Merck. The war measure passed 40 to 2, Whigs joining Democrats. Throughout the war, as Schroeder says, the politically sensitive Whig minority could only harry the administration with a barrage of verbiage while voting for every appropriation which the military campaigns required. The newspaper of the Whigs, the National Intelligencer of Washington, took this position. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who originally voted with the stubborn 14, later voted for war appropriations. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was not yet in Congress when the war began, but after his election in 1846, he had occasion to vote and speak on the war. His spot resolutions became famous. He challenged Polk to specify the exact spot where American blood was shed on the American soil. But he would not try to end the war by stopping funds for men and supplies. Speaking in the House on July 27, 1848, in support of the candidacy of General Zachary Taylor for president, he said, "But as General Taylor is par excellence the hero of the Mexican War, and as you Democrats say, we Whigs have always opposed the war, you think it must be very awkward and embarrassing for us to go for General Taylor. The declaration that we have always opposed the war is true or false, according as one may understand the term oppose the war. If to say the war was unnecessarily and unconstitutionally commenced by the president, be opposing the war, then the Whigs have very generally opposed it. The marching an army into the midst of a peaceful Mexican settlement, frightening the inhabitants away, leaving their growing crops and other property to destruction, to you may appear a perfectly amiable, peaceful, unprovoking procedure, but it does not appear so to us. But if, when the war had begun, and had become the cause of the country, the giving of our money and our blood, in common with yours, was support of the war, then it is not true that we have always opposed the war. With few individual exceptions, you have constantly had our votes here for all the necessary supplies. A handful of anti-slavery congressmen voted against all war measures, seeing the Mexican campaign as a means of extending the southern slave territory. One of these was Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a fiery speaker, physically powerful, who called it an aggressive, unholy, and unjust war. He explained his vote against supplying arms and men. In the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or in robbing them of their country, I can take no part either now or hereafter. The guilt of these crimes must rest on others. I will not participate in them. Giddings pointed to the British Whigs, who, during the American Revolution, announced in Parliament in 1776 that they would not vote supplies for a war to oppress Americans. After Congress acted in May of 1846, there were rallies and demonstrations for the war in New York, Baltimore, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, and many other places. Thousands rushed to volunteer for the army. The poet Walt Whitman wrote in the Brooklyn Eagle in the early days of the war, "Yes, Mexico must be thoroughly chastised. Let our arms now be carried with a spirit which shall teach the world that, while we are not forward for a quarrel, America knows how to crush as well as how to expand." Accompanying all this aggressiveness was the idea that the United States would be giving the blessings of liberty and democracy to more people. This was intermingled with ideas of racial superiority, longings for the beautiful lands of New Mexico and California, and thoughts of commercial enterprise across the Pacific. Speaking of California, the Illinois State Register asked, "Shall this garden of beauty be suffered to lie dormant in its wild and useless luxuriance?" Myriads of enterprising Americans would flock to its rich and inviting prairies. The hum of Anglo-American industry would be heard in its valleys. Cities would rise upon its plains and seacoast, and the resources and wealth of the nation be increased in an incalculable degree. The American Review talked of Mexicans yielding to a superior population, insensibly oozing into her territories, changing her customs, and outliving, outtrading, exterminating her weaker blood. The New York Herald was saying by 1847. The universal Yankee nation can regenerate and disenthrall the people of Mexico in a few years, and we believe it is a part of our destiny to civilize that beautiful country. A letter appeared in the New York Journal of Commerce introducing God into the situation. The supreme ruler of the universe seems to interpose and aid the energy of man towards benefiting mankind. His interposition seems to me to be identified with the success of our arms, that the redemption of 7 million of souls from all the vices that infest the human race is the ostensible object appears manifest. Senator H.V. Johnson said, "I believe we should be recreant to our noble mission if we refused acquiescence in the high purpose of a wise providence. War has its evils. In all ages it has been the minister of wholesale death and appalling desolation. But however inscrutable to us, it has also been made by the all-wise dispenser of events, the instrumentality of accomplishing the great end of human elevation and human happiness. It is in this view that I subscribe to the doctrine of manifest destiny." The Congressional Globe of February 11, 1847 reported, "Mr. Giles of Maryland, I take it for granted that we shall gain territory, and must gain territory, before we shut the gates of the Temple of Janus. We must march from ocean to ocean. We must march from Texas straight to the Pacific Ocean and be bounded only by its roaring wave. It is the destiny of the white race. It is the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race. The American Anti-Slavery Society, on the other hand, said the war was waged solely for the detestable and horrible purpose of extending and perpetuating American slavery throughout the vast territory of Mexico. A 27-year-old Boston poet and abolitionist, James Russell Lowell, began writing satirical poems in the Boston Courier. They were later collected as the Biglow Papers. In them, a New England farmer, Hosea Biglow, spoke in his own dialect on the war. As for war, I call it murder. There you have it, plain and flat. I don't want to go no further than my testament for that. They may talk of freedom's airy, till they're purple in the face. It's a grand, great cemetery for the birthrights of our race. They just want this California so's to lug new slave states in, to abuse you and to scorn you, and to blunder you like sin. The war had barely begun, the summer of 1846, when a writer, Henry David Thoreau, who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax, denouncing the Mexican War. He was put in jail and spent one night there. His friends, without his consent, paid his tax and he was released. 2 years later, he gave a lecture, Resistance to Civil Government, which was then printed as an essay, Civil Disobedience. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars against their wills, aye, against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed and produces a palpitation of the heart. His friend and fellow writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, agreed, but thought it futile to protest. When Emerson visited Thoreau in jail and asked, "What are you doing in there?" it was reported that Thoreau replied, "What are you doing out there?" The churches, for the most part, were either outspokenly for the war or timidly silent. Generally, no one but the Congregational, Quaker, and Unitarian churches spoke clearly against the war. However, one Baptist minister, the Reverend Francis Wayland, president of Brown University, gave 3 sermons in the university chapel in which he said that only wars of self-defense were just, and in case of unjust war, the individual was morally obligated to resist it and lend no money to the government to support it. The Reverend Theodore Parker, Unitarian minister in Boston, combined eloquent criticism of the war with contempt for the Mexican people, whom he called a wretched people, wretched in their origin, history, and character, who must eventually give way as the Indians did. Yes, the United States should expand, he said, but not by war, rather by the power of our ideas, the pressure of her commerce, by the steady advance of a superior race with superior ideas and a better civilization, by being better than Mexico, wiser, humaner, more free and manly. Parker urged active resistance to the war in 1847. Let it be infamous for a New England man to enlist, for a New England merchant to loan his dollars or to let his ships in aid of this wicked war. Let it be infamous for a manufacturer to make a cannon, a sword, or a kernel of powder to kill our brothers. The racism of Parker was widespread. Congressman Delano of Ohio, an anti-slavery Whig, opposed the war because he was afraid of Americans mingling with an inferior people who embrace all shades of color, a sad compound of Spanish, English, Indian, and Negro bloods, and resulting, it is said, in the production of a slothful, ignorant race of beings. As the war went on, opposition grew. The American Peace Society printed a newspaper, The Advocate of Peace, which published poems, speeches, petitions, sermons against the war, and eyewitness accounts of the degradation of Army life and the horrors of battle. The abolitionists, speaking through William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, denounced the war as one of aggression, of invasion, of conquest and rapine, marked by ruffianism, perfidy, and every other feature of national depravity. Considering the strenuous efforts of the nation's leaders to build patriotic support, the amount of open dissent and criticism was remarkable. Anti-war meetings took place in spite of attacks by patriotic mobs. As the army moved closer to Mexico City, the Liberator daringly declared its wishes for the defeat of the American forces. Every lover of freedom and humanity throughout the world must wish them, the Mexicans, the most triumphant success. We only hope that if blood has had to flow, that it has been that of the Americans, and that the next news we shall hear will be that General Scott and his army are in the hands of the Mexicans. We wish him and his troops no bodily harm, but the most utter defeat and disgrace. Frederick Douglass, former slave, extraordinary speaker and writer, wrote in his Rochester newspaper, The North Star, January 21st, 1848, of the present disgraceful, cruel, and iniquitous war with our sister republic. Mexico seems a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxon cupidity and love of dominion. Douglass was scornful of the unwillingness of opponents of the war to take real action. Even the abolitionists kept paying their taxes. The determination of our slave-holding president to prosecute the war and the probability of his success in wringing from the people men and money to carry it on is made evident rather than doubtful by the puny opposition arrayed against him. No politician of any considerable distinction or eminence seems willing to hazard his popularity with his party by an open and unqualified disapprobation of the war. None seem willing to take their stand for peace at all risks, and all seem willing that the war should be carried on in some form or other. Where was popular opinion? It's hard to say. After the first rush, enlistments began to dwindle. The 1846 elections showed much anti-Pope sentiment, but who could tell how much of this was due to the war? In Massachusetts, Congressman Robert Winthrop, who had voted for the war, was elected overwhelmingly against an anti-war Whig. Schroeder concludes that although Polk's popularity fell, general enthusiasm for the Mexican War remained high. But this is a guess. There were no surveys of public opinion at that time. As for voting, a majority of the people did not vote at all. And how did these non-voters feel about the war? Historians of the Mexican War have talked easily about the people and public opinion, like Justin H. Smith, whose 2-volume work, The War with Mexico, has long been a standard account. Of course, too, all the pressure of warlike sentiment among our people had to be recognized more or less, for such is the nature of popular government. Smith's evidence, however, is not from the people, but from the newspapers claiming to be the voice of the people. The New York Herald wrote in August 1845, "The multitude cry aloud for war." And the New York Journal of Commerce, half playfully, half seriously, wrote, "Let us go to war. The world has become stale and insipid. The ships ought to be all captured and the cities battered down and the world burned up so that we can start again. There would be fun in that. Some interest, something to talk about." The New York Morning News said, "Young and ardent spirits that throng the cities want but a direction to their restless energies, and their attention is already fixed on Mexico." Were the newspapers reporting a feeling in the public, or creating a feeling in the public? Those reporting this feeling, like Justin Smith, themselves express strong views about the need for war. Smith, who dedicates his book to Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the ultra-expansionists of American history, makes a long list of Mexican sins against the United States, and ends by saying, "It rested with our government, therefore, as the agent of national dignity and interests, to apply a remedy." He comments on Polk's call for war. In truth, No other course would have been patriotic or even rational. It is impossible to know the extent of popular support of the war, but there is evidence that many organized working men opposed the war. Earlier, when the annexation of Texas was being considered, workingmen meeting in New England protested the annexation. A newspaper in Manchester, New Hampshire wrote, "We have heretofore held our peace in regard to the annexation of Texas, for the purpose of seeing whether a nation would attempt so base an action. We call it base, because it would be giving men that live upon the blood of others an opportunity of dipping their hand still deeper in the sin of slavery. Have we not slaves enough now?" There were demonstrations of Irish workers in New York, Boston, and Lowell against the annexation of Texas, Philip Foner reports. In May, when the war against Mexico began, New York workingmen called a meeting to oppose the war, and many Irish workers came. The meeting called the war a plot by slave owners and asked for the withdrawal of American troops from disputed territory. That year, a convention of the New England Workingmen's Association condemned the war and announced they would not take up arms to sustain the Southern slaveholders in robbing 1/5 of our countrymen of their labor. Some newspapers at the very start of the war protested. Horace Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune, May 12, 1846, "We can easily defeat the armies of Mexico, slaughter them by thousands, and pursue them, perhaps to their capital. We can conquer and annex their territory. But what then? Have the histories of the ruin of Greek and Roman liberty consequent on such extensions of empire by the sword no lesson for us? Who believes that a score of victories over Mexico, the annexation of half our provinces, will give us more liberty, a purer morality, a more prosperous industry than we now have? Is not life miserable enough? Comes not death soon enough without resort to the hideous enginery of war? What of those who fought the war? The soldiers who marched, sweated, got sick, died. The Mexican soldiers, the American soldiers. We know little of the reactions of Mexican soldiers. We do know that Mexico was a despotism, a land of Indians and mestizos, Indians mixed with Spanish, controlled by criollos, whites of Spanish blood. There were 1 million criollos, 2 million mestizos, 3 million Indians. Was the natural disinclination of peasants to fight for a country owned by landlords overcome by the nationalist spirit roused against an invader? We know much more about the American army. Volunteers, not conscripts, lured by money and opportunity for social advancement via promotion in the armed forces. Half of General Taylor's army were recent immigrants, Irish and German mostly. Whereas in 1830, 1% of the population of the United States was foreign-born. By the Mexican War, the number was reaching 10%. Their patriotism was not very strong. Their belief in all arguments for expansion, paraded in the newspapers, was probably not great. Indeed, many of them deserted to the Mexican side, enticed by money. Some enlisted in the Mexican army and formed their own battalion, the San Patricio, St. Patrick's Battalion. At first, there seemed to be enthusiasm in the army, fired by pay and patriotism. Martial spirit was high in New York, where the legislature authorized the governor to call 50,000 volunteers. Placards read, "Mexico or death." There was a mass meeting of 20,000 people in Philadelphia. 3,000 volunteered in Ohio. This initial spirit soon wore off. A woman in Greensboro, North Carolina, recorded in her diary, Tuesday, January 5, 1847. Today was a general muster and speeches by Mr. Gorrell and Mr. Henry. General Logan received them in this street and requested all the volunteers to follow after as he walked up and down the street. I saw some 6 or 7 bad-looking persons following, with poor Jim Lane in front. How many poor creatures have been and are still to be sacrificed upon the altar of pride and ambition. Posters appealed for volunteers in Massachusetts. Men of old Essex, men of Newburyport, rally around the bold, gallant, and lion-hearted Cushing. He will lead you to victory and to glory. They promised pay of $7 to $10 a month, and spoke of a federal bounty of $24 and 160 acres of land. But one young man wrote anonymously to the Cambridge Chronicle, "Neither have I the least idea of joining you or in any way assisting the unjust war waging against Mexico. I have no wish to participate in such glorious butcheries of women and children as were displayed in the capture of Monterey, etc. Neither have I any desire to place myself under the dictation of a petty military tyrant, to every caprice of whose will I must yield implicit obedience. No siree. As long as I can work, beg, or go to the poorhouse, I won't go to Mexico to be lodged on the damp ground, half starved, half roasted, bitten by mosquitoes and centipedes, stung by scorpions and tarantulas, marched, drilled, and flogged, and then stuck up to be shot at for $8 a month and putrid rations. Well, I won't. Human butchery has had its day, and the time is rapidly approaching when the professional soldier will be placed on the same level as a bandit, the Bedouin, and the thug." Reports grew of men forced to be volunteers, impressed for service. One, James Miller of Norfolk, Virginia, protested that he had been persuaded by the influence of an unusual quantity of ardent spirits to sign a paper enrolling for military service. "Next morning I was dragged aboard of a boat landed at Fort Monroe and closely immured in the guardhouse for 16 days. There were extravagant promises and outright lies to build up the volunteer units." A man who wrote a history of the New York Volunteers declared, "If it is cruel to drag black men from their homes, how much more cruel it is to drag white men from their homes under false inducements, and compelling them to leave their wives and children, without leaving a cent or any protection, in the coldest season of the year, to die in a foreign and sickly climate. Many enlisted for the sake of their families, having no employment, and having been offered 3 months' advance, and were promised that they could leave part of their pay for their families to draw in their absence. I boldly pronounce that the whole regiment was got up by fraud, a fraud on the soldier, a fraud on the city of New York, and a fraud on the government of the United States." By late 1846, recruitment was falling off, so physical requirements were lowered, and anyone bringing in acceptable recruits would get $2 a head. Even this didn't work. Congress in early 1847 authorized 10 new regiments of regulars to serve for the duration of the war, promising them 100 acres of public land upon honorable discharge. But dissatisfaction continued. Volunteers complained that the regulars were given special treatment. Enlisted men complained that the officers treated them as inferiors. And soon the reality of battle came in upon the glory and the promises. On the Rio Grande before Matamoros, as a Mexican army of 5,000 under General Arista faced Taylor's army of 3,000, the shells began to fly, and artilleryman Samuel French saw his first death in battle. John Weems describes it. He happened to be staring at a man on horseback nearby when he saw a shot rip off the pommel of the saddle, tear through the man's body, and burst out with a crimson gush on the other side. Pieces of bone or metal tore into the horse's hip, split the lip and tongue, and knocked teeth out of a second horse and broke the jaw of a third. Lieutenant Grant with the 4th Regiment saw a ball crash into ranks nearby, tear a musket from one soldier's grasp, and rip off the man's head, then dissect the face of a captain he knew. When the battle was over, 500 Mexicans were dead or wounded. There were perhaps 50 American casualties. Weems describes the aftermath. Night-blanketed, weary men who fell asleep where they dropped on the trampled prairie grass, while around them other prostrate men from both armies screamed and groaned in agony from wounds. By the eerie light of torches, the surgeons saw was going the livelong night. Away from the battlefield in the army camps, the romance of the recruiting posters was quickly forgotten. A young artillery officer wrote about the men camped at Corpus Christi in the summer of 1845, even before the war began. It becomes our painful task to allude to the sickness, suffering, and death from criminal negligence. 2/3 of the tents furnished the army on taking the field were worn out and rotten, provided for campaigning in a country almost deluged 3 months in the year. During the whole of November and December, either the rains were pouring down with violence, or the furious northers were showering the frail tent poles and rending the rotten canvas. For days and weeks, every article in hundreds of tents was thoroughly soaked. During those terrible months, the sufferings of the sick in the crowded hospital tents were horrible beyond conception. The 22nd Regiment of Mississippi Rifles, moving into New Orleans, was stricken by cold and sickness. The regimental surgeon reported, 6 months after our regiment had entered the service, we had sustained a loss of 167 by death and 134 by discharges. The regiment was packed into the holds of transports, 800 men into 3 ships. The surgeon continued. The dark cloud of disease still hovered over us. The holds of the ships were soon crowded with the sick. The effluvia was intolerable. The sea became rough. Through the long night, the rolling ship would dash the sick man from side to side, bruising his flesh upon the rough corners of his berth. The wild screams of the delirious, the lamentations of the sick, and the melancholy groans of the dying kept up one continual scene of confusion. 4 weeks we were confined to the loathsome ships, and before we had landed at the Brazos, we consigned 28 of our men to the dark waves. Meanwhile, by land and by sea, Anglo-American forces were moving into California. A young naval officer, after the long voyage around the southern cape of South America and up the coast to Monterey in California, wrote in his diary, Asia will be brought to our very doors. Population will flow into the fertile regions of California. The resources of the entire country will be developed. The public lands lying along the route of railroads will be changed from deserts into gardens, and a large population will be settled. It was a separate war that went on in California, where Anglo-Americans raided Spanish settlements, stole horses, and declared California separated from Mexico the Bear Flag Republic. Indians lived there, and Naval Officer Revere gathered the Indian chiefs and spoke to them, as he later recalled. I have called you together to have a talk with you. The country you inhabit no longer belongs to Mexico, but to a mighty nation whose territory extends from the great ocean you have all seen or heard of to another great ocean, thousands of miles toward the rising sun. I am an officer of that great country, and to get here have traversed both of those great oceans in a ship of war, which, with a terrible noise, spits forth flames and hurls forth instruments of destruction, dealing death to all our enemies. Our armies are now in Mexico and will soon conquer the whole country. But you have nothing to fear from us if you do what is right, if you are faithful to your new rulers. We come to prepare this magnificent region for the use of other men, for the population of the world demands more room, and here is room enough for many millions who will hereafter occupy and till the soil. But in admitting others, we shall not displace you, if you act properly. You can easily learn, but you are indolent. I hope you will alter your habits and be industrious and frugal and give up all the low vices which you practice. But if you are lazy and dissipated, you must, before many years, become extinct. We shall watch over you and give you true liberty. But beware of sedition, lawlessness, and all other crimes, for the army which shields can assuredly punish, and it will reach you in your most retired hiding places. General Kearny moved easily into New Mexico, and Santa Fe was taken without battle. An American staff officer described the reaction of the Mexican population to the U.S. Army's entrance into the capital city. Our march into the city was extremely warlike, with drawn sabers and daggers in every look. From around corners, men with surly countenances and downcast looks regarded us with watchfulness, if not terror, and black eyes looked through lattice windows at our column of cavaliers, some gleaming with pleasure and others filled with tears. As the American flag was raised and the cannon boomed its glorious national salute from the hill, the pent-up emotions of many of the women could be suppressed no longer. As the wail of grief arose above the din of our horses' tread and reached our ears from the depth of the gloomy-looking buildings on every hand. That was in August. In December, Mexicans in Taos, New Mexico, rebelled against American rule. As a report to Washington put it, many of the most influential persons in the northern part of this territory were engaged in the rebellion. The revolt was put down, and arrests were made. But many of the rebels fled and carried on sporadic attacks, killing a number of Americans, then hiding in the mountains. The American army pursued, and in a final desperate battle, in which 600 to 700 rebels were engaged, 150 were killed, and it seemed the rebellion was now over. In Los Angeles, too, there was a revolt. Mexicans forced the American garrison there to surrender in September 1846. The United States did not retake Los Angeles until January after a bloody battle. General Taylor had moved across the Rio Grande, occupied Matamoros, and now moved southward through Mexico. But his volunteers became more unruly on Mexican territory. Mexican villages were pillaged. One officer wrote in his diary in the summer of 1846, "We reached Barita about 5 p.m. Many of the Louisiana volunteers were there, a lawless, drunken rabble. They had driven away the inhabitants, taken possession of their houses, and were emulating each other and making beasts of themselves." Cases of rape began to multiply. As the soldiers moved up the Rio Grande to Camargo, the heat became unbearable, the water impure, and sickness grew, diarrhea, dysentery, and other maladies, until 1,000 were dead. At first, the dead were buried to the sounds of the Dead March, played by a military band. Then the number of dead was too great, and formal military funerals ceased. Southward to Monterey and another battle, where men and horses died in agony, and one officer described the ground as slippery with foam and blood. After Taylor's army took Monterey, he reported some shameful atrocities by the Texas Rangers, and he sent them home when their enlistment expired. But others continued robbing and killing Mexicans. A group of men from a Kentucky regiment broke into one Mexican dwelling, threw out the hut, threw husband, and raped his wife. Mexican guerrillas retaliated with cruel vengeance. As the American armies advanced, more battles were fought, more thousands died on both sides, more thousands were wounded, more thousands sick with disease. At one battle north of Chihuahua, 300 Mexicans were killed and 500 wounded, according to the American accounts, with few Anglo-American casualties. The surgeons are now busily engaged in administering relief to the wounded Mexicans, and it is a sight to see the pile of legs and arms that have been amputated. An artillery captain named John Vinton, writing to his mother, told of sailing to Veracruz. "The weather is delightful, our troops in good health and spirits, and all things look auspicious of success. I am only afraid the Mexicans will not meet us and give us battle. For to gain everything without controversy after our large and expensive preparations would give us officers no chance for exploits and honors." Vinton died during the siege of Veracruz. The U.S. bombardment of the city became an indiscriminate killing of civilians. One of the Navy's shells hit the post office. Others burst all over the city. A Mexican observer wrote, "The surgical hospital, which was situated in the convent of Santo Domingo, suffered from the fire, and several of the inmates were killed by fragments of bombs bursting at that point. While an operation was being performed on a wounded man, the explosion of a shell extinguished the lights, and when other illumination was brought, the patient was found torn in pieces, and many others dead and wounded." In 2 days, 1,300 shells were fired into the city until it surrendered. A reporter for the New Orleans Delta wrote, "The Mexicans variously estimate their loss at from 500 to 1,000 killed and wounded, but all agree that the loss among the soldiery is comparatively small, and the destruction among the women and children is very great." Colonel Hitchcock, coming into the city, wrote, "I shall never forget the horrible fire of our mortars, going with dreadful certainty and bursting with sepulchral tones, often in the center of private dwellings. It was awful. I shudder to think of it." Still, Hitchcock, the dutiful soldier, wrote for General Scott a sort of address to the Mexican people, which was then printed in English and Spanish by the tens of thousands, saying, "We have not a particle of ill will towards you. We treat you with all civility. We are not in fact your enemies. We do not plunder your people or insult your women or your religion. We are here for no earthly purpose except the hope of obtaining a peace." That was Hitchcock the soldier. Then we have Weems the historian. If Hitchcock, the old anti-war philosopher, thus seemed to fit Henry David Thoreau's description of small movable forts and magazines at the service of some unscrupulous man in power, it should be remembered that Hitchcock was first of all a soldier, and a good one, as conceded even by the superiors he had antagonized. It was a war of the American elite against the Mexican elite, each side exhorting, using, killing its own population as well as the other. The Mexican commander, Santa Anna, had crushed rebellion after rebellion, his troops also raping and plundering after victory. When Colonel Hitchcock and General Winfield Scott moved into Santa Anna's estate, they found its walls full of ornate paintings, but half his army was dead or wounded. General Winfield Scott moved toward the last battle for Mexico City with 10,000 soldiers. They were not anxious for battle. 3 days' march from Mexico City, at Jalapa, 7 of his 11 regiments evaporated, their enlistment times up. Justin Smith writes, "It would have been quite agreeable to linger at Jalapa, but the soldiers had learned what campaigning really meant. They had been allowed to go unpaid and unprovided for. They had met with hardships and privations not counted upon at the time of enlistment. Disease, battle, death, fearful toil, and frightful marches had been found realities. In spite of their strong desire to see the halls of the Montezumas, out of about 3,700 men, only enough to make one company would re-engage, and special inducements offered by the general to remain as teamsters proved wholly ineffective." On the outskirts of Mexico City, at Churubusco, Mexican and American armies clashed for 3 hours. As Weems describes it, "Those fields around Churubusco were now covered with thousands of human casualties and with mangled bodies of horses and mules that blocked roads and filled ditches. 4,000 Mexicans lay dead or wounded. 3,000 others had been captured, including 69 U.S. Army deserters who required the protection of Scott's officers to escape execution at the hands of their former comrades. The Americans lost nearly 1,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing." As often in war, battles were fought without point. After one such engagement near Mexico City, with terrible casualties, a Marine lieutenant blamed General Scott. He had originated it in error and caused it to be fought with inadequate forces for an object that had no existence. In the final battle for Mexico City, Anglo-American troops took the height of Chapultepec and entered the city of 200,000 people, General Santa Anna having moved northward. This was September 1847. A Mexican merchant wrote to a friend about the bombardment of the city. "In some cases, whole blocks were destroyed, and a great number of men, women, and children killed and wounded." General Santa Anna fled to Huamantla, where another battle was fought, and he had to flee again. An infantry lieutenant wrote to his parents what happened after an officer named Walker was killed in battle. "General Lane told us to avenge the death of the gallant Walker, to take all we could lay hands on. And well and fearfully was his mandate obeyed. Grog shops were broken open first, and then, maddened with liquor, every species of outrage was committed. Old women and girls were stripped of their clothing, and many suffered still greater outrages. Men were shot by dozens, their property, churches, stores, and dwelling houses ransacked. Dead horses and men lay about pretty thick, while drunken soldiers, yelling and screeching, were breaking open houses or chasing some poor Mexicans who had abandoned their houses and fled for life. Such a scene I never hope to see again. It gave me a lamentable view of human nature and made me for the first time ashamed of my country. The editors of Chronicles of the Gringos sum up the attitude of the American soldiers to the war. Although they had volunteered to go to war, and by far the greater number of them honored their commitments by creditably sustaining hardship in battle, and behaved as well as soldiers in a hostile country are apt to behave, they did not like the army, they did not like war, and generally speaking, they did not like Mexico or the Mexicans. This was the majority, disliking the job, resenting the discipline and caste system of the army, and wanting to get out and go home. One Pennsylvania volunteer stationed at Matamoros late in the war wrote, "We are under very strict discipline here. Some of our officers are very good men, but the balance of them are very tyrannical and brutal toward the men. Tonight on drill, an officer laid a soldier's skull open with his sword. But the time may come, and that soon, when officers and men will stand on equal footing. A soldier's life is very disgusting." On the night of August 15, 1847, volunteer regiments from Virginia, Mississippi, and North Carolina rebelled in northern Mexico against Colonel Robert Treat Paine. Paine killed a mutineer, but two of his lieutenants refused to help him quell the mutiny. The rebels were ultimately exonerated in an attempt to keep the peace. Desertion grew. In March 1847, the Army reported over 1,000 deserters. The total number of deserters during the war was 9,207, 5,331 regulars, 3,876 volunteers. Those who did not desert became harder and harder to manage. General Cushing referred to 65 such men in the 1st Regiment of the Massachusetts Infantry as incorrigibly mutinous and insubordinate. The glory of the victory was for the President and the generals, not the deserters, the dead, the wounded. Of the 2nd Regiment of Mississippi Rifles, 167 died of disease. 2 regiments from Pennsylvania went out 1,800 strong and came home with 600. John Calhoun of South Carolina said in Congress that 20% of the troops had died of battle or sickness. The Massachusetts volunteers had started with 630 men. They came home with 300 dead, mostly from disease, and at the reception dinner on their return, their commander, General Cushing, was hissed by his men. The Cambridge Chronicle wrote, "Charges of the most serious nature against one and all of these military officials dropped daily from the lips of the volunteers." As the veterans returned home, speculators immediately showed up to buy the land warrants given by the government. Many of the soldiers, desperate for money, sold their 160 acres for less than $50. The New York Commercial Advertiser said in June 1847, "It is a well-known fact that immense fortunes were made out of the poor soldiers who shed their blood in the Revolutionary War by speculators who preyed upon their distresses. A similar system of depredation was practiced upon the soldiers of the last war." Mexico surrendered. There were calls among Americans to take all of Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed February 1848, just took half. The Texas boundary was set at the Rio Grande. New Mexico and California were ceded. The United States paid Mexico $15 million, which led the Whig intelligencer to conclude that we take nothing by conquest, thank God. Chapter 9. Slavery without submission, emancipation without freedom. The United States government's support of slavery was based on an overpowering practicality. In 1790, 1,000 tons of cotton were being produced every year in the South. By 1860, it was 1,000,000 tons. In the same period, 500,000 slaves grew to 4 million. A system harried by slave rebellions and conspiracies, Gabriel Prosser, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822, Nat Turner, 1831, developed a network of controls in the southern states backed by the laws, courts, armed forces, and race prejudice of the nation's political leaders. It would take either a full-scale slave rebellion or a full-scale war to end such a deeply entrenched system. If a rebellion, It might get out of hand and turn its ferocity beyond slavery to the most successful system of capitalist enrichment in the world. If a war, those who made the war would organize its consequences. Hence it was Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves, not John Brown. In 1859, John Brown was hanged with federal complicity for attempting to do by small-scale violence what Lincoln would do by large-scale violence several years later: end slavery. With slavery abolished by order of the government, true, a government pushed hard to do so by blacks, free and slave, and by white abolitionists, its end could be orchestrated so as to set limits to emancipation. Liberation from the top would go only so far as the interests of the dominant groups permitted. If carried further by the momentum of war, the rhetoric of crusade, it could be pulled back to a safer position. Thus, while the ending of slavery led to a reconstruction of national politics and economics, it was not a radical reconstruction, but a safe one. In fact, a profitable one. The plantation system, based on tobacco growing in Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, and rice in South Carolina, expanded into lush new cotton lands in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and needed more slaves. But slave importation became illegal in 1808. Therefore, from the beginning, the law went unenforced, says John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom. The long, unprotected coast, the certain markets, and the prospects of huge profits were too much for the American merchants, and they yielded to the temptation. He estimates that perhaps 250,000 slaves were imported illegally before the Civil War. How can slavery be described? Perhaps not at all by those who have not experienced it. The 1932 edition of a best-selling textbook by two Northern liberal historians saw slavery as perhaps the Negro's necessary transition to civilization. Economists or cliometricians, statistical historians, have tried to assess slavery by estimating how much money was spent on slaves for food and medical care. But can this describe the reality of slavery as it was to a human being who lived inside it? Are the conditions of slavery as important as the existence of slavery? John Little, a former slave, wrote, "They say slaves are happy because they laugh and are merry. I myself and 3 or 4 others have received 200 lashes in the day and had our feet in fetters. Yet at night we would sing and dance and make others laugh at the rattling of our chains. Happy men we must have been. We did it to keep down trouble and to keep our hearts from being completely broken. That is as true as the gospel. Just look at it. Must not we have been very happy? Yet I have done it myself. I have cut capers in chains." A record of deaths kept in a plantation journal, now at the University of North Carolina Archives, lists the ages and cause of death of all those who died on the plantation between 1850 and 1855. Of the 32 who died in that period, only 4 reached the age of 60. 4 reached the age of 50. 7 died in their 40s. 7 died in their 20s or 30s, and 9 died before they were 5 years old. But can statistics record what it meant for families to be torn apart when a master for profit sold a husband or a wife, a son or a daughter? In 1858, a slave named Abraham Scriven was sold by his master and wrote to his wife, "Give my love to my father and mother and tell them goodbye for me. And if we shall not meet in this world, I hope to meet in heaven." One recent book on slavery, Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman, Time on the Cross, looks at whippings in 1840 to 1842 on the Barrow Plantation in Louisiana with 200 slaves. The records show that over the course of 2 years, a total of 160 whippings were administered, an average of 0.7 whippings per hand per year. About half the hands were not whipped at all during the period. One could also say, half of all slaves were whipped. That has a different ring. That figure, 0.7 per hand per year, shows whipping was infrequent for any individual. But looked at another way, once every 4 or 5 days, some slave was whipped. Barrow, as a plantation owner, according to his biographer, was no worse than the average. He spent money on clothing for his slaves, gave them holiday celebrations, built a dance hall for them. He also built a jail and was constantly devising ingenious punishments, for he realized that uncertainty was an important aid in keeping his gangs well in hand. The whippings, the punishments, were work disciplines. Still, Herbert Gutman, Slavery and the Numbers Game, finds dissecting Fogel and Engerman's statistics. Overall, 4 in 5 cotton pickers engaged in one or more disorderly acts in 1840 to 41. As a group, a slightly higher percentage of women than men committed 7 or more disorderly acts. Thus, Gutman disputes the argument of Fogel and Engerman that the Barrow plantation slaves became devoted, hard-working, responsible slaves who identified their fortunes with the fortunes of their masters. Slave revolts in the United States were not as frequent or as large-scale as those in the Caribbean islands or in South America. Probably the largest slave revolt in the United States took place near New Orleans in 1811. 400 to 500 slaves gathered after a rising at the plantation of a Major Andry. Armed with cane knives, axes, and clubs, they wounded Andry, killed his son, and began marching from plantation to plantation, their numbers growing. They were attacked by U.S. Army and militia forces. 66 were killed on the spot, and 16 were tried and shot by firing squad. The conspiracy of Denmark Vesey, himself a free Negro, was thwarted before it could be carried out in 1822. The plan was to burn Charleston, South Carolina, then the 6th largest city in the nation, and to initiate a general revolt of slaves in the area. Several witnesses said thousands of blacks were implicated in one way or another. Blacks had made about 250 pikeheads and bayonets, and over 300 daggers, according to Herbert Apthecker's account. But the plan was betrayed, and 35 blacks, including Vesey, were hanged. The trial record itself, published in Charleston, was ordered destroyed soon after publication as too dangerous for slaves to see. Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, in the summer of 1831, threw the slave-holding South into a panic, and then into a determined effort to bolster the security of the slave system. Turner, claiming religious visions, gathered about 70 slaves who went on a rampage from plantation to plantation, murdering at least 55 men, women, and children. They gathered supporters, but were captured as their ammunition ran out. Turner and perhaps 18 others were hanged. Did such rebellions set back the cause of emancipation, as some moderate abolitionists claimed at the time? An answer was given in 1845 by James Hammond, a supporter of slavery. But if your course was wholly different, if you distilled nectar from your lips and discoursed sweetest music, do you imagine you could prevail on us to give up 1,000 millions of dollars in the value of our slaves and 1,000 millions of dollars more in the depreciation of our lands? The slave owner understood this and prepared. Henry Tragle, the Southampton slave revolt of 1831, says, "In 1831, Virginia was an armed and garrisoned state, with a total population of 1,211,405. The state of Virginia was able to field a militia force of 101,488 men, including cavalry, artillery, grenadiers, riflemen, and light infantry. It is true that this was a paper army in some ways, and that the county regiments were not fully armed and equipped, but it is still an astonishing commentary on the state of the public mind of the time. During a period when neither the state nor the nation faced any sort of exterior threat, we find that Virginia felt the need to maintain a security force, roughly 10% of the total number of its inhabitants, black and white, male and female, slave and free. Rebellion, though rare, was a constant fear among slave owners. Ulrich Phillips, a Southerner whose American Negro Slavery is a classic study, wrote, "A great number of Southerners at all times held the firm belief that the Negro population was so docile, so little cohesive, and in the main so friendly toward the whites, and so contented, that a disastrous insurrection by them would be impossible. But on the whole, there was much greater anxiety abroad in the land than historians have told of." Eugene Genovese, in his comprehensive study of slavery, Roll, Jordan, Roll, sees a record of simultaneous accommodation and resistance to slavery. The resistance included stealing property, sabotage and slowness, killing overseers and masters, burning down plantation buildings, running away. Even the accommodation breathed a critical spirit and disguised subversive actions. Most of this resistance, Genevieve stresses, fell short of organized insurrection, but its significance for masters and slaves was enormous. Running away was much more realistic than armed insurrection. During the 1850s, about 1,000 slaves a year escaped into the North, Canada, and Mexico. Thousands ran away for short periods, and this despite the terror facing the runaway. The dogs used in tracking fugitives bit, tore, mutilated, and if not pulled off in time, killed their prey, Genevieve says. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, her head injured by an overseer when she was 15, made her way to freedom alone as a young woman, then became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She made 19 dangerous trips back and forth, often disguised, escorting more than 300 slaves to freedom, always carrying a pistol, telling the fugitives, "You'll be free or die." She expressed her philosophy. "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man should take me alive." One overseer told a visitor to his plantation that some Negroes are determined never to let a white man whip them and will resist you when you attempt it. Of course, you must kill them in that case. One form of resistance was not to work so hard. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in The Gift of Black Folk, "As a tropical product with a sensuous receptivity to the beauty of the world, he was not as easily reduced to be the mechanical draft horse which the northern European laborer became. He tended to work as the results pleased him, and refused to work or sought to refuse when he did not find the spiritual returns adequate. Thus he was easily accused of laziness and driven as a slave when in truth he brought to modern manual labor a renewed valuation of life." Ulrich Phillips described truancy, absconding, vacations without leave, and resolute efforts to escape from bondage altogether. He also described collective actions. Occasionally, however, a squad would strike in a body as a protest against severities. An episode of this sort was recounted in a letter of a Georgia overseer to his absent employer. "Sir, I write you a few lines in order to let you know that 6 of your hands has left the plantation, every man but Jack. They displease me with their work, and I give some of them a few lashes, Tom with the rest. On Wednesday morning they were missing." The instances where poor whites helped slaves were not frequent, but sufficient to show the need for setting one group against the other. Genevieve says, "The slaveholders suspected that non-slaveholders would encourage slave disobedience and even rebellion, not so much out of sympathy for the blacks as out of hatred for the rich planters and resentment of their own poverty. White men sometimes were linked to slave insurrectionary plots, and each such incident rekindled fears." This helps explain the stern police measures against whites who fraternized with blacks. Herbert Aptheker quotes a report to the governor of Virginia on a slave conspiracy in 1802. "I have just received information that 3 white persons are concerned in the plot, and they have arms and ammunition concealed under their houses, and were to give aid when the Negroes should begin." One of the conspiring slaves said that it was the common run of poor white people who were involved. In return, blacks helped whites in need. One black runaway told of a slave woman who had received 50 lashes of the whip for giving food to a white neighbor who was poor and sick. When the Brunswick Canal was built in Georgia, the black slaves and white Irish workers were segregated, the excuse being that they would do violence against one another. That may well have been true, but Fanny Kemble, the famous actress and wife of a planter, wrote in her journal, "But the Irish are not only quarrelers and rioters and fighters and drinkers and despisers of niggers. They are a passionate, impulsive, warm-hearted, generous people, much given to powerful indignations, which break out suddenly when not compelled to smolder sullenly. Pestilent sympathizers, too, and with a sufficient dose of American atmosphere air in their lungs, properly mixed with a right proportion of ardent spirits. There is no saying but what they might actually take to sympathy with the slaves, and I leave you to judge of the possible consequences. You perceive, I am sure, that they can by no means be allowed to work together on the Brunswick Canal." The need for slave control led to an ingenious device. paying poor whites, themselves so troublesome for 200 years of Southern history, to be overseers of black labor and therefore buffers for black hatred. Religion was used for control. A book consulted by many planters was the Cotton Plantation Record and Account Book, which gave these instructions to overseers. You will find that an hour devoted every Sabbath morning to their moral and religious instruction would prove a great aid to you in bringing about a better state of things amongst the Negroes. As for black preachers, as Genovese puts it, they had to speak a language defiant enough to hold the high-spirited among their flock, but neither so inflammatory as to rouse them to battles they could not win, nor so ominous as to arouse the ire of ruling powers. Practicality decided. The slave communities, embedded as they were among numerically preponderant and militarily powerful whites, counseled a strategy of patience, of acceptance of what could not be helped, of a dogged effort to keep the black community alive and healthy, a strategy of survival that, like its African prototype, above all said yes to life in this world. It was once thought that slavery had destroyed the black family, and so the black condition was blamed on family frailty rather than on poverty and prejudice. Blacks without families, helpless, lacking kinship and identity, would have no will to resist. But interviews with ex-slaves done in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project of the New Deal for the Library of Congress showed a different story, which George Rawick summarizes from sundown to sunup. The slave community acted like a generalized extended kinship system in which all adults looked after all children, and there was little division between my children for whom I'm responsible and your children for whom you're responsible. A kind of family relationship in which older children have great responsibility for caring for younger siblings is obviously more functionally integrative and useful for slaves than the pattern of sibling rivalry and often dislike that frequently comes out of contemporary middle-class nuclear families composed of highly individuated persons. Indeed, the activity of the slaves in creating patterns of family life that were functionally integrative did more than merely prevent the destruction of personality. It was part and parcel, as we shall see, of the social process out of which came black pride, black identity, black culture, the black community, and black rebellion in America. Old letters and records dug out by historian Herbert Gutman, The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, show the stubborn resistance of the slave family to pressures of disintegration. A woman wrote to her son, from whom she had been separated for 20 years, "I long to see you in my old age. Now, my dear son, I pray you to come and see your dear old mother. I love you, Cato. You love your mother. You are my only son." And a man wrote to his wife, sold away from him with their children, "Send me some of the children's hair in a separate paper with their names on the paper. I had rather anything to had happened to me most than ever to have been parted from you and the children. Laura, I do love you the same." Going through records of slave marriages, Gutman found how high was the incidence of marriage among slave men and women, and how stable those marriages were. He studied the remarkably complete records kept on one South Carolina plantation. He found a birth register of 200 slaves extending from the 18th century to just before the Civil War. It showed stable kin networks, steadfast marriages, unusual fidelity, and resistance to forced marriages. Slaves hung on determinedly to themselves, to their love of family, their wholeness. A shoemaker on the South Carolina Sea Islands expressed this in his own way. "I has lost an arm, but it hasn't gone out of my brains." This family solidarity carried into the 20th century. The remarkable Southern black farmer, Nate Shaw, recalled that when his sister died, leaving 3 children, his father proposed sharing their care, and he responded, "That suits me, Papa. Let's handle him like this. Don't get the 2 little boys, the youngest ones, off at your house, and the oldest one be at my house, and we hold these little boys apart and won't bring them to see one another. I'll bring the little boy that I keep, the oldest one, around to your home amongst the other 2, and you forward the others to my house, and let them grow up knowing that they are brothers. Don't keep them separated in a way that they'll forget about one another. Don't do that, Papa." Also insisting on the strength of blacks even under slavery, Lawrence Levine, black culture and black consciousness, gives a picture of a rich culture among slaves, a complex mixture of adaptation and rebellion throughout the creativity of stories and songs. We raise the wheat, they give us the corn. We bake the bread, they give us the crust. We sift the meal, they give us the husk. We peel the meat, they give us the skin. And that's the way they take us in. We skim the pot, they give us the liquor, and said that's good enough for a nigger. There was mockery. The poet William Cullen Bryant, after attending a corn shucking in 1843 in South Carolina, told of slave dances turned into a pretended military parade, a sort of burlesque of our militia trainings. Spirituals often had double meanings. The song, "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan," often meant that slaves meant to get to the north, their Canaan. During the Civil War, slaves began to make up new spirituals with bolder messages. "Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be saved." And the spiritual, "Many thousand go. No more peck of corn for me, no more, no more. No more driver's lash for me, no more, no more." Levine refers to slave resistance as pre-political, expressed in countless ways in daily life and culture. Music, magic, art, religion were all ways, he says, for slaves to hold on to their humanity. While Southern slaves held on, free blacks in the North, there were about 130,000 in 1830 and about 200,000 in 1850, agitated for the abolition of slavery. In 1829, David Walker, son of a slave but born free in North Carolina, moved to Boston where he sold old clothes. The pamphlet he wrote and printed, Walker's Appeal, became widely known. It infuriated Southern slaveholders. Georgia offered a reward of $10,000 to anyone who would deliver Walker alive, and $1,000 to anyone who would kill him. It is not hard to understand why when you read his appeal. There was no slavery in history, even that of the Israelites in Egypt, worse than the slavery of the black man in America, Walker said. Show me a page of history, either sacred or profane, in which a verse can be found which maintains that the Egyptians heaped the insupportable insult upon the children of Israel by telling them that they were not of the human family. Walker was scathing to his fellow blacks who would assimilate. "I would wish candidly to be understood that I would not give a pinch of snuff to be married to any white person I ever saw in all the days of my life. Blacks must fight for their freedom," he said. "Let our enemies go on with their butcheries and at once fill up their cup. Never make an attempt to gain our freedom or natural right from under our cruel oppressors and murderers until you see your way clear. When that hour arrives and you move, be not afraid or dismayed. God has been pleased to give us 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 feet, and some sense in our heads as well as they. They have no more right to hold us in slavery than we have to hold them. Our sufferings will come to an end, in spite of all the Americans this side of eternity. Then we will want all the learning and talents among ourselves, and perhaps more, to govern ourselves. Every dog must have its day. The Americans is coming to an end." One summer day in 1830, David Walker was found dead near the doorway of his shop in Boston. Some born in slavery acted out the unfulfilled desire of millions. Frederick Douglass, a slave, sent to Baltimore to work as a servant and as a laborer in the shipyard, somehow learned to read and write, and at 21 in the year 1838, escaped to the North, where he became the most famous black man of his time as lecturer, newspaper editor, writer. In his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he recalled his first childhood thoughts about his condition. "Why am I a slave? Why are some people slaves and others masters? Was there ever a time when this was not so? How did the relation commence? Once, however, engaged in the inquiry, I was not very long in finding out the true solution of the matter. It was not color, but crime. Not God, but man that afforded the true explanation of the existence of slavery. Nor was I long in finding out another important truth, viz., what man can make, man can unmake. I distinctly remember being, even then, most strongly impressed with the idea of being a free man someday. This cheering assurance was an inborn dream of my human nature, a constant menace to slavery, and one which all the powers of slavery were unable to silence or extinguish. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850, was a concession to the southern states in return for the admission of the Mexican War territories, California especially, into the Union as non-slave states. The act made it easy for slave owners to recapture ex-slaves, or simply to pick up blacks they claimed had run away. Northern blacks organized resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, denouncing President Fillmore, who signed it, and Senator Daniel Webster, who supported it. One of these was J.W. Logan, son of a slave mother and her white owner. He had escaped to freedom in his master's horse, gone to college, and was now a minister in Syracuse, New York. He spoke to a meeting in that city in 1850. The time has come to change the tones of submission into tones of defiance, and to tell Mr. Fillmore and Mr. Webster, if they propose to execute this measure upon us, to send on their bloodhounds. I received my freedom from heaven, and with it came the command to defend my title to it. I don't respect this law, I don't fear it, I won't obey it. It outlaws me, and I outlaw it. I will not live as slave, and if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man. Your decision tonight in favor of resistance will give vent to the spirit of liberty, and it will break the bands of party and shout for joy all over the North. Heaven knows that this act of noble daring will break out somewhere, and may God grant that Syracuse be the honored spot whence it will send an earthquake voice throughout the land. The following year, Syracuse had its chance. A runaway slave named Jerry was captured and put on trial. A crowd used crowbars and a battering ram to break into the courthouse, defying marshals with drawn guns, and set Jerry free. Logan made his home in Syracuse, a major station on the Underground Railroad. It was said that he helped 1,500 slaves on their way to Canada. His memoir of slavery came to the attention of his former mistress, and she wrote to him asking him either to return or to send her $1,000 in compensation. Logan's reply to her was printed in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Mrs. Sarah Logue, you say you have offers to buy me, and that you shall sell me if I do not send you $1,000. And in the same breath, and almost in the same sentence, you say, you know we raised you as we did our own children. Woman, did you raise your own children for the market? Did you raise them for the whipping post? Did you raise them to be driven off, bound to a coffle and chains? Shame on you. But you say I am a thief, because I took the old mare along with me. Have you got to learn that I had a better right to the old mare, as you call her, than Manseth Logue had to me? Is it a greater sin for me to steal his horse than it was for him to rob my mother's cradle and steal me? Have you got to learn that human rights are mutual and reciprocal, and if you take my liberty and life, you forfeit your own liberty and life? Before God and high heaven, is there a law for one man which is not a law for every other man? If you or any other speculator on my body and rights wish to know how I regard my rights, they need but come here and lay their hands on me to enslave me. Yours, etc., J.W. Logan. Frederick Douglass knew that the shame of slavery was not just the South's, that the whole nation was complicit in it. On the 4th of July, 1852, he gave an Independence Day address. Fellow citizens, pardon me and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. 10 years after Nat Turner's rebellion, there was no sign of black insurrection in the South. But that year, 1841, one incident took place which kept alive the idea of rebellion. Slaves being transported on a ship, the Creole, overpowered the crew, killed one of them, and sailed into the British West Indies, where slavery had been abolished in 1833. England refused to return the slaves. There was much agitation in England against American slavery. And this led to angry talk in Congress of war with England, encouraged by Secretary of State Daniel Webster. The colored people's press denounced Webster's bullying position and, recalling the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, wrote, "If war be declared, will we fight in defense of a government which denies us the most precious right of citizenship? The states in which we dwell have twice availed themselves of our voluntary services, and have repaid us with chains and slavery. Shall we a third time kiss the foot that crushes us? If so, we deserve our chains." As the tension grew north and south, blacks became more militant. Frederick Douglass spoke in 1857. "Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reforms. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing upon the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." There were tactical differences between Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, white abolitionist and editor of The Liberator. Differences between black and white abolitionists in general. Blacks were more willing to engage in armed insurrection, but also more ready to use existing political devices, the ballot box, the Constitution, anything to further their cause. They were not as morally absolute in their tactics as the Garrisonians. Moral pressure would not do it alone. The blacks knew it. It would take all sorts of tactics, from elections to rebellion. How ever present in the minds of Northern Negroes was the question of slavery is shown by black children in a Cincinnati school, a private school financed by Negroes. The children were responding to the question, "What do you think most about?" Only 5 answers remain in the records, and all refer to slavery. A 7-year-old child wrote, "Dear schoolmates, we are going next summer to buy a farm and to work part of the day and to study the other part if we live to see it, and come home part of the day to see our mothers and sisters and cousins if we are got any, and see our kind folks and to be good boys, and when we get a man, to get the poor slaves from bondage. And I am sorrow to hear that the boat went down with 200 poor slaves from up the river. Oh, how sorrow I am to hear that. It grieves my heart so that I could faint in 1 minute." White abolitionists did courageous and pioneering work